Hey everybody, I'm Shane, and I'm really glad to be with you as we finish up our series on seeing God at work in ourselves, others, and the world around us. The series is called How to See God, and today we're going to talk about what that actually looks like in our everyday lives. But before we get there, let me just tell you a quick story. In middle school, one of the best moments of my life up until that point was making the baseball team. Seventh grade for me, my middle school was 7th and 8th grade. I remember trying out for the team, being so nervous about whether or not I would make it. And then when that last day came and I found out that I had finally officially made the roster, I was pumped, so excited. And these are the kinds of moments that stick with us for a long time. They're what we call mountaintop moments. They're the highest of highs, the major milestones, the peak of your life in that season. Okay, look. We may not all experience the exhilaration of climbing to the top of a mountain, but throughout our lives, we're all gonna have those moments that are extraordinary. And as humans, we live for those mountaintop moments. We love them, we celebrate them, we get excited about them, and we remember them like forever. And as Christians, those major mountaintop moments, well, those can happen in our faith too. Here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that unforgettable worship service on that last night of camp. You know what I'm talking about. Or maybe when you watch a YouTube video that speaks to exactly what's going on in your life. That feels memorable. Or it's how excited you were when you first started following Jesus. You'll never forget that feeling. I'm talking about those types of mountaintop moments. The mountaintop moments in our faith, well, they're the ones when we see God most clearly. When those major moments happen, we feel close to God, we feel loved by God, and we feel seen by God. And moments like that, well, they make it a lot easier to see God at work in our lives, right? But here's my question for you. But what happens when those moments end? I mean, think about this. What happens when we get home from camp and our parents are still fighting? Or when we get lost scrolling on YouTube and we forget about that meaningful message that we just watched? Or when something difficult happens in our lives that feels like the opposite of an answered prayer? When things go from really great to really bad, it feels like we've toppled right off that mountaintop, doesn't it? And maybe it isn't even that extreme. I mean, maybe it's just when things go from great to just okay. What happens when we go from an extraordinary mountaintop experience with God to then settling back into the ordinary parts of everyday life? We go back to a full day of classes, or the boredom of a weekend with no plans, or the regular schedule of the rehearsals, or the fights with our siblings, or the long list of chores at home. I mean, you get the point, right? Just like that, seeing God at work in our lives can become a little bit more difficult. So if you're here today and you're not sure about all this faith stuff, that's okay. I want you to hear me in that. In fact, maybe this is a part of the reason why you've struggled with your faith in the first place. I mean, maybe you've never had one of those mountaintop experiences with God. When everyone else seems like they're connecting with God in big ways, there's some of us that may wonder if any of this is legit at all. We've never felt or experienced God that way, so how can we be sure all of this is real? Look, no matter what your experience with God has been, often when we think about seeing God, we think of these really big emotional moments. We think of the mountaintops. But if we're honest, we'd all have to admit that those moments and the feelings that come with them, well, they don't last forever. So then what happens? If our faith is built on the highs alone, what happens in the lows that we experience in life? Or more often, what happens in the ordinary of our everyday lives? I mean, maybe the question that we need to ask ourselves is this: how can we see God in the everyday? Well, let me just go ahead and clear this up really quick. There's reason to believe that ordinary moments are some of the best ways to see God at work. Yeah, I know, but just hear me out. How do we know this? Because God proved it a really long time ago. We find this moment in the Old Testament book of the Bible called 1 Kings. Chances are this is a book of the Bible that you haven't spent a ton of time reading, but let me just tell you, this book is filled with all sorts of adventures. See, the book of 1 Kings is like a history of what was happening to God's people when they had, you guessed it by the title, kings. And some of these kings, well, they were great. Most of them, though, were not great. And often, God would send prophets to the not-so-good kings to share important messages that these kings really needed to hear. And one of these prophets is a guy named Elijah. Okay, so that's the setup as to what we're gonna read, but in this book of the Bible that's called 1 Kings, remember that, we find the story of this guy that we just talked about, Elijah. And this guy had a life that was full of extraordinary moments. He performed miracles. He called down fire from heaven. How amazing does that sound? If I could have done that as a 7th grade boy, that would have been just like unbelievable. My friends would have been freaking out. And this guy even confronted kings and queens, like in really direct ways. He had some pretty intense conversations with them. This guy had some major mountaintop moments all over his story. But in one of the moments where Elijah needed God most, God didn't show up exactly as expected. And that's the moment we'll meet Elijah in today. As we pick up in his story, Elijah was literally on a mountain where he really needed to see God. See, he was worried about the future. He was unsure of what he was supposed to do. And he was wondering if the same God who showed up in miraculous ways before would show up for him in that moment specifically. Check it out. Go out and stand before me on the mountain, the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. I'm sure that Elijah, who was used to seeing God work in some pretty incredible ways, was expecting to see God in the windstorm or the earthquake or the fire. Like that would have been more normal to him. These seemed to match up with the other mountaintop experiences that Elijah had already had. But God wasn't in any of those moments. This was definitely not what Elijah expected. To be clear, this doesn't mean that mountaintop experiences with God aren't actually legit. I want you to hear me say that. I think in Elijah's story, God wanted to make a clear point to him. And that might be why God didn't show up the way Elijah thought that God would show up. In fact, check out what happens next. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Wait. After all the fire, smoke, earthquakes, wind, all that stuff, God chose to show up to Elijah in the sound of a gentle whisper? And I don't know about you, but this is not what I would expect from the powerful creator of the entire universe. While there may have been multiple lessons that God wanted to teach Elijah in this moment, I think there's one of them that can be really helpful for us too. See, I think God showed up to Elijah in the sound of a whisper to show him and to show us today that God could be seen in the simple moments too. Sure, God can grab our attention in moments of high emotion, once-in-a-lifetime experiences, or significant events that mark our faith journeys. But at the same time, God is at work in our everyday, ordinary lives. And if we open our eyes to see it, we can see God at work in those moments just as clearly as we can in those mountaintop experiences. We can look for God every day. Remember, Paul told us that we can see the fruit or the evidence of God's Spirit at work in the world this way. But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. All of the stuff on that list, it's stuff that we can see not just on the mountaintop moments of life, but in our everyday lives too. It's in the joy that we see on our younger siblings' face when we get home from school and like they're just excited to see us. It's in the love that we feel from a grandparent when they pick us up from practice. It's in the peace that we experience when we take a deep breath after a long day. It's in the kindness of a friend who helps us out with our homework. All of these are like really incredibly ordinary moments. That's just what they are. But are they still evidence of the fruit of God's Spirit at work? For sure. They absolutely are. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss the fact that God is invisible. I know God is invisible. And of course, because God is invisible, it makes it pretty much impossible to literally see God. And in a world that's full of distractions and difficulties, it can be even harder to focus our hearts on seeing the goodness of God in ourselves, others, or the world around us. I'm just saying that we don't have to worry that God isn't there. We don't have to believe that God is only at work in the mountaintop moments. We don't have to wonder if we're missing it. See, instead, we can look for God every single day. And when we do, we can trust that God will meet us there in the major milestones of the mountaintop moments and in the gentle whispers of our everyday lives. So, how can we become people whose eyes are open to God in the everyday, ordinary moments of life? Well, this week, I want us to try 3 things. First, look for God. We can do this in the everyday habits that we build to help us grow in our faith. It could be hearing from God by reading the Bible, or maybe it's spending time in prayer, or talking with other people about God, or living out the example of Jesus when it comes to how we treat ourselves and other people. At times, these practices, they're gonna feel ordinary, but they're absolutely things that we can trust will help us see God more clearly, especially when we do them over time. Okay, so that's the first step that we can take. The second one is this: look at others. We can also see evidence of God at work in our everyday interactions with other people. Where do you see the fruit of God's Spirit in someone else? Maybe it's in your older brother's kindness, or your parents' gentleness, or your best friend's joy, or your small group leader's faithfulness. Those are all simple things that could happen on a regular basis. And they're also all ways that you can see God at work in the everyday through others. And there are also ways that you can see God at work in the everyday, ordinary things of life through other people. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 is to look at yourself. I'm serious about this one. It's really important. Where do you see God working in you? Maybe it's in the patience that you have with your younger sibling, or in the kindness that you show to your stepmom. It's in the goodness of enjoying your favorite meal, in the peace that you bring to your friend group. Look, these kinds of simple moments are evidence of God working in you. I don't want you to miss those, because yes, God is at work in the world around you, God is at work in other people, but God is also at work in you. As we close this series, let me encourage you to just do one thing. Look for God every day. Look, you can see God. The God who loves you, who cares for you, and wants to know you. You can see that God at work within you and around you all the time, in the highest mountaintop moments and even in the lowest valleys of struggle. In the ordinary parts of everyday life, well, you can see God in those moments too. You just have to look. When you head to small group, I want you to be thinking about your response to this question. What's one ordinary part of your life that you could look for God in this week?